Welcome to the WUDC Distinguished Speaker Lectures. In these talks, we aim to spotlight exceptional debaters with unique perspectives on the world. Each talk consists of three elements. Firstly, the speaker will present a topic and the research, work, or experience in the field. Secondly, the speaker will connect the topic to debating. And thirdly, we'll wrap up each talk with a Q&A section. The first few episodes all revolve around gender and feminism and are organized in cooperation with the Gender Open Competition. Today, our speaker is Ameera Natasha Moore. Ameera is a law graduate from the International Islamic University of Malaysia, IIUM. During her university years, she was hired by IIUM as a lecturer in the World Oratory department. Given her passion in fighting for gender equality, as part of her legal internship, she worked at the Women's Aid Organization, an organization aimed to raise awareness about domestic violence and provide shelter and support for survivors. Furthermore, she had the privilege of attending a semester at the University of Leicester, where she took up gender in politics, legal psychology, and international law. Throughout last year, Ameera was located in Shanghai, China, where she worked as an associate director to a debate company, LearningLeaders. Debate-wise, Ameera has a wide set of experience, including being a 3-time Asian champion, a Cambridge AV champion in both the Open and ESL categories, an Ostol's ESL champion, as well as making history by being part of the first and only ESL team to have won the Ostol Asian Championship in the Open category. She was also the overall best ESL speaker at Worlds. Ameera served on the Edge course of Worlds, the HWS Round Robin, Asia BP, the Oxford AV, the Cambridge AV, Cambridge Women's, Malaysian Nationals, Ostol Women's, and the Ostol Asian Championship, and many more. Ameera was the co-coach of WSDC Malaysia 2017 to 2018 that broke top at WSDC and has judged the finals of 3 Euros, 2 Worlds, 2 Ostols, Asia BP, as well as being awarded as the overall best judge in Asia at Asia BP 2018 and chairing the Open finals at Worlds. Her most recent title includes the DCA of WSDC 2020 and biggest cheerleader of WSDC 2021, which I'm obviously very supportive of.
WUDC, WSDC.
WUDC 2021. Ameera's talk is titled Hell Hath No Fury, Like a Woman Scored by Higher Than Thou, a critical look into Islam and its relationship with feminism and how the two interact within the Asian cultural context of the past, present, and future. The talk is centered around religion, Asia, and feminism. I'm Dan Love, and I'll host the talk. Notes will be in the channel, so if you like the content, please subscribe. Without further ado, Ameera, the stage is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited. So should I just start sharing the screen for the slides? Yeah, good. So the title of my talk will be A Look into Islam and its Relationship with Feminism Within the Asian Cultural Context. An index of my talk will be an introduction of myself, and just so that it's not a constant me chapter, what I will do is also highlight on the experiences that I have had as a feminist, as well as a person that grew up within a Muslim community, and how that life application can be attached towards this talk. Secondly is we'll be looking into the definition of Islamic feminism, and then how Islam expanded to the rest of Asia, the struggles of Islamic feminists in Asia, several strives and bumps of women's rights in Islam. So we'll be looking into more specific sets of examples of practices, and then as well as something that's a little bit more explicitly debate applicable, which are debate motions. So a little bit about myself. I think on top of that very generous introduction that Dan already gave, stepping a little bit outside of the debate context, I was born in Malaysia. Right off the bat, when I was 6 years old, before I even went into formal education, I was already sent to an Islamic tuition program where they teach you how to read the Quran. So you have to familiarize yourself with a lot of the Arabic characters, like they call it like the Iqra program. So I was already exposed to very explicit Islamic teachings from a very young age. And then from 6 to 11 years old, from Malaysia, I moved to another Muslim majority country, which is Indonesia. Over there, I went to an Islamic private school. And I think from my experience of being in Indonesia and being a part of their formal education over there, I noticed quite a stark difference in the practice of Islam that occurred within that community, specifically where I went to, which was in Jakarta, versus the kind of Islam that was practiced here in Malaysia, both in the capital, so Jakarta, and Kuala Lumpur. Despite being neighboring countries and two of the Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia, there was already a huge difference. So for example, in Indonesia, when I was schooling over there, there was never a huge highlight that men and women weren't allowed to touch. So for example, in school, it was very common that after class, a lot of the younger students would go up to the teachers, regardless of what gender they were, and kind of like shake hands to say thank you for the knowledge that you have passed on to us. And even though, according to explicit Islamic rulings, these teachers were not a family member, so by right, you shouldn't be allowed to touch them. But I think there was this connotation in the educational system that I went to that there ought to be no sexual or romantic connotation that occurs between teacher and student. As a result, you ought to view these teachers as your parents, and teachers ought to view these students as their children. And this was very different in comparison to when I came to Malaysia, that it was not a big thing in formal education that had a lot of Islamic influences for opposite genders to touch, even as platonic interactions such as shaking hands. From there, I came back to Malaysia. I was homeschooled for a bit, and then I went into the public school system and also went into the after-school Islamic program. And from there, it's also really interesting to note that in Malaysia, it's very common, and I think also in Indonesia, it's very common for you to get like an after-school Islamic program, whether that is based off of a formal Islamic school that actually teaches after-school programs, or for parents to just hire somebody who is known as an ustaz or an ustazah, which is just like a religious way of referring to your religious teacher. And these people would be figures from your community mosque, right? So on one hand, it seems like it's an accessible thing for you to get formal Islamic education, that you can just get someone who is an expert in religion from your local mosque. On the other hand, it's also kind of concerning that it's so decentralized how we decide who gets to have close relationships and close contact with children, that there was no metric or standard in deciding that this person is capable of teaching a child, but rather just basing it purely on what kind of religious knowledge did you actually have. And I think this becomes a lot more concerning, the point at which the after-school Islamic program, like the one that I got, was a more informal one where my parents would hire someone from the local mosque. And at that age, I was around 11 or 12. And that's basically when you first start going through puberty, right? And in religion, there is, especially in Islam, there is a huge religious connotation that comes with the idea of going through puberty, because the idea is that you're now going into adulthood, and being an adult, you now have a whole bunch of religious duties that you didn't before as a child. So if you were a woman, this meant that if you were on your period, there is an ability for you to be a mother. There was an ability for you to be a wife. There was an ability for you to be able to understand your actions overnight, despite being a 12-year-old. And I think a lot of the narrative surrounding what it's like to go through puberty, and I think there is quite a regretful narrative that I'm sure is not exclusive to Islam, but also exists in society. But I think more specifically in the experience that I went through, the regretful narrative surrounding period and why it is that women ought to be ashamed of this very natural occurrence that is happening. So it's sad when you don't have a vetting process for who gets to teach your children. On top of that, you have no vetting process to ensure that they know how to teach children these sensitive topics. Not that it's sensitive because it's a taboo, but it's sensitive because these are important issues that need to be taught with care to make sure that the child is able to perceive themselves from a good light when talking about those things in relation to their body. So I think that was another experience that I went through going through that after-school Islamic program. From there, I moved on to a Malay science stream boarding school, which was known to be Malay, which is a race in Malaysia, the majority race, but also was pretty heavily influenced by Islam. And that is because in Malaysia, there is a high conflation between race and religion. So in our constitution, a Malay person is defined as someone who is of the Islamic religion, practices Malay culture, and somewhat habitually speaks the Malay language. So according to our constitution, you can't be a Malay if you're not a Muslim. So because it was a Malay science stream boarding school, and because of the affirmative action policies that happen in Malaysia for Malays, there are a lot of privileges that are granted to Malays. Part of that includes setting up a lot of boarding schools that got a lot more resources in terms of getting better education. But along with that, that also meant that there was a lot of emphasis towards the Islamic structures of it. This meant that the school was not just providing the basic syllabus that the Malaysian education system expects you to, but that means the school also endorses things like compulsory wearing of the hijab, moral policing bodies that were made up of student bodies. So I guess when I watch like Western TV shows, it's like you have the student body. In my school, we didn't just have like the student body. You also had the Islamic student body that was in charge of moral policing and checking on students if they were actually praying, or if they felt like the student was straying away from the teachings of Islam and needed an intervention. So that was an interesting observation that I had. But it was during this time as well that I started my debating career. And then at the age of 16, I became part of what I think is recorded as the first time Malaysia ever had a team go on to WSDC. And then from there, I went to the International Islamic University Malaysia, where I studied civil law and Islamic law. This means that in IIUM, it's not enough for you to just have like criminal law. For every criminal law that you learn, there's a different subject called Islamic criminal law. For every family law, there's an Islamic family law. So we learn both side by side. And then there's also the non-legal Islamic worldview studies, which are subjects that are a compulsory requirement for all students in IIUM, regardless of what field you are in. And then I started debate coaching IIUM and WSDC Malaysia also at that time. From then, as mentioned before, I went for an exchange program, and then I did my legal internship at Women's Aid Organization, because at that point in time, I already decided that I was less interested in working for a law firm, and I did not envision myself practicing law as a full-time lawyer, but rather someone that was much more invested in advocacy work. And then from there, throughout all of last year, I was working in LearningLeaders Shanghai, where I was an on-site coach for about 9 months. And then the next remaining 3 months, I went on to write for them remotely from Malaysia. So that's a little bit about myself. So hopefully this will give enough of an information to say that hopefully I am talking about this topic and can give people reassurance that these are all a lot of my personal experiences out of being exposed to feminism and Islam, but also some of it is based on the formal education that I did receive, especially in IIUM. I think I have a lot of gratitude towards the institution for enlightening me a lot more about my community. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a video.
Across the world, more and more Muslim women are fighting for gender equality. Scholars, political figures, and activists are scrutinizing verses within the Quran that concern gender roles in Islam. Because in many cases, it is scripture that's formed the basis of laws and customs that govern gender equality. Scripture like this, which in part reads, "Men are in charge of women, because Allah hath made the one of them to excel the other. So good women are the obedient, guarding in secret that which Allah hath guarded." For centuries, Muslim scholars have taken this verse to mean that Muslim men have authority and guardianship, or qawama, over women. And according to scholars like Saba Mahmood, this interpretation is one of the key obstacles holding back gender equality within Islam.
There are other schools of Islamic thought which argue that, in fact, the idea of qawama, or the idea of guardianship, is something that needs to be broadened given how Islamic societies have changed, the world has changed.
But today there are many, many examples of how the traditional guardianship interpretation is still the norm in many parts of the Muslim world. In Saudi Arabia, a woman cannot leave the house unless she is accompanied by a man. And in Egypt, a man can divorce his spouse without grounds or going to court, but a woman cannot. And there are many more examples of rules that are based on the premise that men have a God-given authority over women. However, in the fight for gender equality, Islamic feminists aren't taking that as a given.
There is a very strong movement to interpret the Quran and the Prophet's life through a feminist lens. And their argument is that, look, we believe in Islam and the truth of Islam, but we also think that the subordinate status of women in Islam is a function of the way that these scriptures have been interpreted.
And that's another important thing to know.
So, yeah, that was just a little bit of introductory video to, I think, give people some bit of an overview of what this talk will be about. So, okay, definition about Islamic feminism. So I think there are many ways to define it, obviously, the same way as how when it comes to feminism per se, many different scholars and many different movements will find many different ways to define it. The same applies here in Islamic feminism. But I guess to simplify it for the purposes of a basic understanding, Islamic feminism is not simply a feminism that is born from Muslim cultures, but one that engages Islamic theology through the texts and canonical religious traditions. So this means that Islamic feminism isn't just about fighting for gender equality based off of like current cultures of the way Islam is being practiced, but rather that the Islamic feminists are also very big on the idea of going back to all of the roots and the pillars of Islam and looking back at the Quran and the Prophet's practices and basically surpassing the middleman that was literally made up of mostly men, to basically say that, you know what, we think that many of these texts were interpreted in such a way that favored men and oppressed women, and as a result, we're going to take matters into our own hands. So it builds on the Quranic concept of equality of all human beings and insists on the application of this theology in everyday life. And I think when we talk about Islamic feminism, often women's issues are trivialized into whether or not to wear the veil, or is it okay for you to shake hands with men outside of their family, when in fact that's just like the tip of the iceberg, and there are many much more urgent issues, but also just like a whole bunch of diverse types of issues that exist when it comes to the concerns of Muslim feminists. So before moving on further, I just wanted to provide a clarification on a feminist who is a Muslim versus Islamic feminist, because I think that these two things get conflated, but they are very, very different. So feminist who is a Muslim is someone who believes in feminism, believes in gender equality, believes in the construction of an Islamic God and faith, may or may not include in the belief of like the Islamic worldly institutions like Sharia courts and how hierarchies work in their local mosques, but generally like they are a believer, and they also believe in gender equality. But most of the times they basically fight for feminism that is outside of the religious framework. So this means that one can be a feminist and a Muslim at the same time, but when they're talking about the feminist cause, they're not necessarily concerned with a lot of the policies or practices that are within the Islamic legal framework, but more about like, I believe in pro-choice because of, you know, whatever logical reasoning based off of that, and not necessarily using any of the Islamic reasonings. Whereas Islamic feminists are ones that believe in an Islamic God and faith, believes in the Islamic institution and worldly rulings. They just want to fight for the reinterpretation and the reform of those institutions. So they know that these institutions exist. They do believe they should exist. They just should not exist in the way that a lot of the patriarchy have constructed it to be. So this lecture focuses on the latter, which is Islamic feminists. Secondly, I think we also need to remember that much like our understanding of general secular feminists and feminism, there are many kinds of Islamic feminists. Like, they don't all fight for the same policies. The same way as how I think we fall into this trap, especially in debate land or even like in our own liberal bubbles, that when we think a person is a feminist, it means that they are pro a whole shopping list of things, which is that they are pro sexual freedom, they are pro choice, they are pro LGBTQIA. I mean, versus the reality of the situation, whereas like there are some women who are pro sexual freedom and are pro choice, but are not as pro LGBTQIA, or there are women who are pro equal opportunity and pro equal pay, but don't believe that sex work is a legitimate choice, right? So again, the same way as how many of these choices can overlap and the kind of concerns they want to address, the same thing would occur within Islamic feminism as well. So I think it's important to not just like place them in the same box, that all of them behave in the same way. So context on how did Islam expand to the rest of Asia, before we can even go into like the kind of practices that have come either at the expense of women or even practices that actually do empower women. So Islam was first set out in the Middle East. And the reason why I say the rest of Asia is because, you know, geographically speaking, the Middle East, Central Asia, many people would consider that basically part of Asia, right? And so Islam was first set out in the Middle East, and then they started their expansion towards the eastern regions through trade, and this was encouraged by the development of the maritime Silk Roads, which basically meant that it connected Europe, some parts of Africa, the Arab Peninsula, subcontinent Asia, Southeast Asia, and China. Communities from the Arab Peninsula back then were known as great traders and sailors. So when the sailors would go off to trade and, you know, were known as like great shipmen, the traders had to stop at multiple ports in order to restock resources. And during their stops, the people who were from those ships, as well as the local communities, would interact. So like in Malaysia, we would constantly learn about how like Straits of Malacca is one of the most important trading channel, of which a lot of international traders would have to go through in order to in order to sail from the west to the east. So along with that interaction came a lot of exchange of cultural norms, non-institutional proselytization. So there was no formal mercenaries or no formal like proselytizers that would actively go out and make it their job. But I think by sheer cultural exchange and building friendships and talking about your lives, a lot of the Muslim sailors eventually did non-institutional and informal proselytization that attracted some people towards the idea of Islam. Furthermore, this also led to like marriage to aristocrats for diplomatic purposes, leading to conversions of communities. So a lot of the Arab sailors that came to Southeast Asia, or any parts of Asia, actually even up towards the Far East, a lot of those connections, whoever was deemed as more elite amongst the sailors would eventually gain attraction from the aristocrats and the royalty and the monarchies from different countries. And basically as part of a political step to creating better diplomatic ties, to concretize the support towards these aristocrats and those hierarchies and those monarchies, people would get married, right? Like kings would marry off their daughters to some of these sailors. And then that led to a lot of conversions of communities, because according to Islam, you can't marry a non-Muslim. There are some exceptions, but I'm not going to get into that for the purposes of clarity of this talk. So struggles of Islamic feminists in Asia. So fast forward to from how Islam came to Malaysia, how Islam came to Asia, and how we're dealing with it right now, is that, first of all, there is a huge confusing spectrum of what exactly is culture and what exactly is religion. Because there is, you know, before Islam came, there was a huge Hindu influence within Asia. So a lot of our culture and a lot of our language also stems from Hindu backgrounds and Sanskrit languages, versus not just purely Arab or Islamic influences. So I think it's not clear now as to what is religion and what is culture. And it doesn't help when there are countries that conflate the two into saying that, well, your ethnicity, your race, your culture, your religion, they're all intertwined with each other. So there are times where Muslim women find it difficult to argue and decide when it's okay to not wear the hijab, or when it's okay to touch the opposite gender and not pray 5 times a day, you know, and presumably all of that is okay. Suddenly it's also not okay to drink alcohol and not fast during Ramadan and have premarital sex, right? So there's like this selective approach towards which actually is kind of okay because maybe that's a little bit more cultural, versus like the religion actually saying you can't do that, so maybe it's actually fine. And then, you know, the other thing that is supposedly perceived as much more religious and sinful, we kind of keep away from that. And the thing is, as you go through the generations, you will also see that the examples change, because I think of the argument that the younger or the newer the generation, the much more globalized that generation is, and is exposed to a wide variety of information and media that normalizes a whole set of different practices and actions as well. So that's why in like a set of younger generation, you'll also see Muslims who are sometimes okay with premarital sex and alcohol, but, you know, as long as you don't proudly speak about it. But all of a sudden, when you speak about consumption of pork, it's like, no, that's the line, right? And all of this is very arbitrary. But I think that's what makes it so difficult for a lot of Islamic feminists to kind of argue, because they can't quite identify which one is culture and which one is religion. Secondly, is that there is this relationship between Islam as a religion and nationalism. So when colonization happened, colonization robbed communities off of agency. And for some Muslim majority countries, this also meant robbing them from the ability to fully practice Islam in public and political spheres. And Islam as a religion is not just a private religion, because it is meant to be like a holistic religion that tells you what to do, not just like in your private time, but also like how a state should run itself in order to ensure like equality and equity. So it was important for many Muslims to also be able to channel that practice into the public and political spheres. And obviously when colonization came, colonizers were like, nope, that's not happening. So when colonization ended, it was seen as an opportunity to truly embrace what was our identity before the colonizers came. So I think from that moment onwards, anything that was oppositional to what is deemed as our identity, which was pre-colonization, and if people try to challenge that now, it's perceived as betrayal, that you are threatening the loyalty to your country and culture, and you're being ungrateful, because there was a time where we couldn't even practice our religion freely because colonizers had us at their mercy. So I think that also makes it difficult. And you see a lot of, and I'm sure that this is not just like a thing that is specific just to Islam. Actually, I'm very sure that it applies to elsewhere, with culture and nationalism, and why it is that there is a huge tie between the two. And anytime people try to challenge that culture, it is deemed as a betrayal towards their nationalist pride. Thirdly, is that I did a lot of research, and I realized that there's not enough Islamic feminists, like big established Islamic feminist groups in like East Asia, like moving away from the Middle East. There are some, but there aren't enough, because a lot of them are located in like Central Asia, Middle East. And this is difficult because in order to galvanize change, you need critical mass, because you are not just fighting the patriarchy, which, by the way, is not an easy thing to do and still requires critical mass. But on top of that, you're fighting a religious establishment. So they don't just use, your everyday argument in order to entrench gender inequality, but they also try to fearmonger by using sin as a narrative to kind of clamp down on any opposition. So I think that's a huge downer. One of the biggest Islamic feminist groups that do exist stepping outside of Central Asia, Middle East, is Sisters in Islam, which is a group that is based in Malaysia. They're actually doing quite a lot of good work, and I think that it would be unfair to not mention them, because I do think that if people want to search up on Islamic feminist groups that are East Asia based, they should definitely look into Sisters of Islam. Furthermore, a huge difficulty that Islamic feminists in Asia face is translation difficulties with resources. Because if it's true that Islamic feminism is about reinterpretation and reformation about our understanding of the Quran and a lot of the Prophet's practices, because those are the two things, right? The Quran and the Sunnah, which is the Prophet's practices, are the two things that Muslims use to derive a lot of what the rulings in Islam are. So if it's true that we need to do these two things, those two things are in Arabic, right? It requires a high proficiency in Arabic for you to be able to do the job of reinterpretation. So a lot of East Asians aren't very fluent in Arabic, and it makes sense, right? Because it's not our native language. A lot of secondary resources are also in English, sorry, not Arabic. A lot of secondary resources, sources are also in English. And there exist high numbers of these sources in English, but again, a lot of Asian countries don't have English as its first language. So again, I think that if you want to look at the primary source of where we derive rulings from, it's in Arabic. You need high proficiency in Arabic, to the extent where there was a lot of support and resources for other scholars and feminists to do that reinterpretation for Asian women. Oftentimes it's done in English, and then it's kind of like so many interpretations are happening along the way. So it's like Arabic and then into English, and then you got to do it in Malay. And I think it's scary because a lot of things also get lost in translation, right? So I think that's one of the biggest difficulties. And again, even if there are countries, Asian countries that do have English as their native language, oftentimes these are countries that don't put a high premium on producing or collecting Islamic literature because they're not Muslim majority countries. So I actually think that that's like a really, really huge obstacle that Asian Islamic feminists face. Furthermore, there is the rejection of international treaties as part of preservation of culture. So for example, like Malaysia has a huge reservation on the CEDAW clauses, which is a agreement, an international agreement basically for the protection of gender equality. And we're signatories of it, but we put reservations, like the legal term is like reservations on some of the clauses. And oftentimes we actually make reservations on clauses that probably have the hugest impact. And that's probably why we had reservations about those clauses, because we knew that it had huge implications on what kind of laws we would actually be pushing for in our home country. And Malaysia isn't the only one. There are other countries as well that have reservations to these international treaties and agreements that are pushed by like the UN and UN Women to get better gender equality. And then we also have issues about domestic violence that oftentimes, in the worst case, lead to things like marital rape because of the connotation that husbands are deemed as having authority over wives. And again, this stems from a lot of the interpretation of the holy text that basically says that husbands act as an agent of the wife, and not just husbands and wife. I think just the dynamic between men and women. There are many texts that implicitly or explicitly hint at men having agency over these women. And then there are issues about religious freedom, which again creates a complication because if women don't, like if Islamic feminists also believe in choices for women, if part of that choice is wanting to convert out of Islam, and some Islamic feminists say that, look, if we truly care about Islam, then we should truly care about people who do want to stay in the religion, those people who we don't need to coerce and trap into needing to keep to their faith. And for the women that don't want to stay in Islam, let them leave, right? But for some situations, like in Malaysia, you can't convert. And then there's the issue about moral policing. So as if it wasn't bad enough to have abstract societal norms and secular laws and policies that are also being responsible for causing gender inequality, now there's an added layer of formal moral policing. So again, I think this is where Malaysia tries to replicate a little bit more of what we see in the Middle East, which is it's not just about having Sharia courts deal with marital issues such as contract to enter into a marriage or inheritance, but down to things like we have punishments in Malaysia if you drink alcohol or if you are found to have premarital sex. And there's like a whole different standard of evidence to that. According to the Islamic ruling, basically, in order for you to punish someone for premarital sex, you can only do so if you have 4 witnesses. Rarely do you have 4 witnesses in premarital sex. And so what they do is they end up punishing people who come into proximity with premarital sex. So all that means is that if a man and a woman is found in an enclosed space and they are not a family member, you can be charged under the laws of Sharia law in Malaysia, because that's part of moral policing. I think moral policing in general in many Muslim majority countries, or even in minority Muslim communities, even in non-Muslim majority countries, have moral policing. They're just done informally. They're done by society members, where your neighbor is kind of checking on you and being all up in your business. But there are some countries that actively make this an institutionalized thing. And I think that makes it a lot more difficult for Islamic feminists to change a lot of the mindsets that people have and to fight against this taboo, because there are actual institutions and legal backings that support a lot of the inequality that exists. And then lastly is just the norm that you must not be an Islamic prude, but also not be too Western and liberal. So again, this is where the whole cultural pride and nationalism comes in, because we always hear about in debates how non-white communities have an anti-Western sentiment because Westernization is deemed as bad. It's also true that in communities where Islam has a huge following, that there is also a negative connotation towards Arabization. So the whole Islamic prude is basically saying why are you dressing to the extent where you feel like you are a woman from an Arab state, with an abaya and a burqa, and there are bigots on the street who actually say if in America you hear people say go back to your country, go back to Asia. In certain Asian countries, you also hear people saying stuff if you want to dress like that, and you really want to be so Arabized, just leave and go to an Arab country. So that's the thing. And then at the same time, you also can't be too Western. So it's constantly towing this fine line of damned if you do and damned if you don't, which is nothing new in the life of a woman, just in this scenario within an Islamic context. Okay. The strives and bumps of women's rights in Islam. So here I'm going to be highlighting some examples, which could be useful even for debating, whenever you want to point out no, actually there are some good things that exist out there. And again, nothing exists in as good as an absolute. So debatable. So the first strive I want to talk about is divorce. So it's not considered a sin in Islam. That's just a starting point. right? It's not encouraged, but if they feel that staying in the marriage could lead to an injustice, then Islam says, then that's encouraged. So the strive is that divorce is not considered a sin in Islam, and Islamic divorces function by using the metric of talaq. So I've actually seen some motions that use the word talaq. I'm not sure if it's used within this context, but within the Islamic context, this is what it means. So talaq is basically the pronouncement or the implication of divorce in Islam. Now, the pronouncement of talaq is a right of the husband. So a pronouncement of talaq literally just means like the husband saying, I divorce you by dropping a talaq, right? Like people actually explicitly say this. A talaq can be pronounced explicitly or implicitly, but nevertheless, the ability to say that you want to divorce someone, or in other words, talaq someone, that is a right of the husband. Now, the implication of talaq, so basically a situation where it could lead to the implication of having a talaq dropped or that you would eventually be divorced, is a right for both. Now, what many people don't discuss is that a wife can also divorce her husband by way of going straight to the court and filing for divorce. So this is known as khulu. And basically you go to the court on the grounds of the husband either behaving in un-Islamic ways, or that the wife's well-being is at risk, or the wife worries that if she stays within the marriage, she fears she cannot act fairly for the husband. Then the wife testifies to the court. The husband then gets called in to sign some legal papers and basically to say that I, as the husband, mandated by the court, say that a talaq has been recorded. So again, the husband still needs to pronounce the talaq, but the wife can instigate it by virtue of khulu. So that's the strive. The bump of it is that the ability for a woman to divorce still relies on the infrastructure of the courts and there being legitimacy to her claim, versus the ability of a man that on face value gets to divorce as he deems fit. Because he can say it, she needs to go and make a case. So there's like a different standard there. However, courts do take into account that once a wife has gone to court, has made a case, has filed for khulu, that in and of itself is probably a cause for why there will be a marital fallout if the two were forced to stay married as is. So courts do take this into account. So I think that's like a reasonable check and balance. Secondly is a strive, again, which is called ta'liq. So ta'liq is like, think Islamic version of prenuptial agreements. They happen during the marital oath. So when the husband and the wife go to get married, and you have the witnesses and whatever are the expectations in an Islamic marriage and wedding, during that oath, the husband also pronounces that agreement, like he reads it out loud, and that agreement is something that has been made between the two parties as to what would amount to a divorce. So for example, should I ever stop providing financial support to my family for 3 months straight, a talaq will be dropped. So if that actually happens, then one of them just has to go on record and be like, yep, this thing happens, this thing happened, and a talaq will be dropped, right? The bump in it, though, is that because of the notion that women still need a male family member to give her hand in marriage, then basically still propagates the norm that women can't have full agency yet. That agency is still compromised. That when she's not with her husband, there is still a different male family member that is meant to speak on behalf of her and influence her or carry her agency. Now, as a result, in many communities, these agreements have family involved in it that often implicitly pressure women into non-comprehensive agreements that will protect her. So especially in communities where women are pressured to marry, especially in situations where like the future wife's family comes from a less privileged family, and then the future husband's family comes from a much more financially empowered background. Oftentimes, like the woman's family kind of pressures her into like, look, don't make too much noise, just like marry him, just be grateful that he wants to marry you and provide for you. So I think in that situation, again, it shapes a lot of what this prenuptial agreement actually looks like. I mean, obviously it's not exactly a prenuptial agreement, but I think an easier way to understand it is that it is somewhat an Islamic version of prenuptial agreements. Thirdly, is the usage of objectives of Sharia. So like the Arabic term, like Muslim communities use, is like maqasid Sharia. So basically, for every Sharia ruling, they function based on 5 things, and this is according to hierarchy. So the most important thing is protection of religion. So an example of that would be like protection against apostasy. Second is the protection of life. So if your life is being threatened. Thirdly is the protection of intellect, so your mind. Example, protection against intoxication and other substance or drug abuse. Fourth is protection of lineage, so family and marital relations. And lastly is protection of property, so protection of tools that allow you to have a fulfilled life. So whether actual assets or like house, property, money. So these are the 5 things that a lot of the times, I think if not all, a lot of rulings and practices are derived off of. So when a whole bunch of like Islamic scholars or Islamic imams come together and they're like, okay, we are in uncharted waters, there's this new practice. Like for example, when the banning of intoxication first occurred back in the days, they were purely talking about alcohol. They weren't talking about drugs. Like drugs weren't even in the picture in that discussion. But then as society progressed and drug abuse became more rampant, that was when a lot of Muslim scholars were like, okay, so what do we do? And then they kind of used the same ruling that prohibited intoxication via consumption of alcohol. They used that same ruling to say people should not consume drugs for recreational purposes, because both of these things go against the protection of intellect, because you are unable to rationally carry yourself or decide for yourself the times of which you are intoxicated. So many states have used the above to create those rulings. Another a strive of this would actually be about inheritance. So in Islam, when a husband passes away without leaving a will, Sharia has its own formula that divides the money using blood relations and gender as a metric. Like there is an endless list of mathematical formula that was like the bane of my existence when I was studying law in IIUM. It was very, very complicated. But basically, in most situations, usually wives are at the losing end by receiving not much. However, now states have allowed wives to claim for matrimonial property rights. So this means that the wives can make a case that she is the support system that basically enabled the husband to have accumulated all of those wealth. So what happens is that, say for example, the husband's wealth is 100%. The wife can say that I want to claim for matrimonial property rights for 50%. So 50% is mine. The remaining 50% then will be divided according to Sharia law or whatever will it is that my husband left behind, because that is, his right and Islam's right to divide on his behalf. But the remaining 50% was mine, because none of this money would have existed without my help. So I think that's like one of the big strives. The bump in it though is that you need a lot of resources to go to court in order to make your case. And that's pretty hard to do when the reason why you're going to court is because you want more resources, right? So it's kind of like this cycle of I need resources. It's kind of like a job application. Like you need job experience in order to get better job experiences, but the reason why I want that job experience is because I don't have any, right? So the same thing applies here. Okay, fourth strive is that Islam discourages polygamy. So when we're talking about Islam, again, polygamy is like one of the forefronts of things that people keep in mind. Islam is often tainted by this perception. However, it actually started off not from a point of view that encourages men to take on as many wives, right? But it was actually because it was revealed during a period of time that was pre-Islam, where men already had more than 4 wives, like countless of wives, and treated them unfairly. So supposedly the positioning of Islam and their ruling back then was that Islam brought in the rulings for polygamy with the intentions of regulating what was seen as abhorrent practices. So according to the Quran, in An-Nisa verse 3, it says that, basically the verse says that if you ever fear treating your wives unequally, only marry one. And many will argue that given that it is almost humanly impossible to love and treat all wives equally, that in practice it is best to marry one. So that's like the more feminist interpretation of the verse that sanctions polygamy. But the bumps to it are several. Firstly is that the purpose of polygamy seems outdated, that the same non-Muslim practices of marrying more than 4 that Muslim rulings were trying to protect Muslim women from has long since progressed. And what was once seen as a progressive move for Islam to allow only 4 wives has now quickly become no longer viewed in the same light. Secondly is that patriarchal norms in society and institutions do not run a formal check to see that if it is true that the man seeking to marry more than 1 wife is indeed able to support, love, and treat all wives equally. Even if they did want to do these formal checks, it is unclear if they can feasibly quantify love and day-to-day treatment to ensure equality for all wives. Thirdly, is that only men can have multiple spouses and not women. The Islamic reasoning behind this is that it is countered by the narrative that, well, when a woman gets pregnant, it needs to be known who the father is to ensure lineage. Obviously, this is unclear why this is still stagnant and still the case, given the fact that science has also evolved to allow us to figure that out. But again, debatable. Okay. 5th strive, agency. So the agency of a woman, like her rights to work, her rights to own property, her rights to choose a spouse, stems from a huge Islamic feminist figure, which is Khadija, who is Prophet Muhammad, like, you know, the one prophet that like we hold on a higher level in comparison to other prophets. So Khadija was Prophet Muhammad's first wife and the first female follower of Islam. She was a very successful merchant. She was very rich because of her trading business. She chose Muhammad as her husband and sought after him. So she sought after him to propose to her, and they were in a monogamous marriage until she passed. So a lot of the times, many feminists, Islamic feminists, use Khadija as like a huge figure to say that this woman is the reason why you know, we have proof to say that current day women should not be subordinate to men. But the bump to it, though, is that although she is the go-to Islamic feminist figure, many of her practices are countered today by other interpretations of other Islamic rulings. So again, the same way as how many different historical stories and many different holy texts can be seen as contradictory to each other, the same applies here. So sometimes there are just other interpretations and narratives that go against what feminists understood Khadija to be standing for. Another bump is that many say that Khadija's case was the exception to the norm because she was much older than most girls who currently have their first marriages. Like Khadija was 40 when she married Prophet Muhammad, who was 25. So like there's also an argument to say that the dynamics were different and she was a lot more mature. And furthermore, much of Islam had not yet been revealed by God the time at which Prophet Muhammad and Khadija got married, because Khadija was literally like, she was the first female Muslim who believed in him. So that goes to show just like how much earlier on the Prophet was supposedly in during the time of when Islam was first revealed. So people say she cannot be faulted for what was yet to be ordained. So I think this is like a huge downer on the Khadija narrative. So that's basically like the examples. Now, what I'm going to do then is talk a little bit more about like debate motions, just to kind of apply some of the contextual knowledge that I've spoken about before to more debate explicits. Okay, motion. This house would abolish all forms of polygamy. Before that, just for a little bit of fun, this page and some of the following pages just have like some Muslim superheroes that exist in pop culture that I thought would be like a good anecdote to add here that would also be very useful for future debate uses, but also just like for your own use at your own personal time. Like I love reading comic books. So on the right here, well, my right, I assume your right as well, we have Soraya Qadir, who is known as Dust. She's a member of the X-Men, originally born in Afghanistan. She discovered that she had the power to turn into sand-like substance and basically cause a sandstorm after attacking a slave trader who tried to remove her niqab, which is like the face, the facial covering part of her clothing. Okay, that's the first comic book character we're going to see. So this house would abolish all forms of polygamy. So we'll start off with government. So I think just some ideas to run through is that firstly, you can make an argument that, well, we should abolish it because this policy is basically a policy regulated by men to rob female bodies of agency. It's regulated by institutions that are male-dominated with the usage of religious sanctions. Narratives to question that demand and to demand more women in decision-making processes is basically, shaped in to be the same as questioning God, and questioning God is sinful. And that's basically the narrative that the institution runs, right? So as a result, it's harder to bring about change. Secondly, is that because of those same institutions and the notions of male superiority, women who are first wives find it hard to tell their husbands that she doesn't want more wives. Like she doesn't want to bring in like a second wife into their home. So I think a lot of the times when we speak about polygamy, all we think about is like from the husband's perspective and whether or not they'll be able to act fairly. Or we oftentimes think about like the fourth or the third wife, and would you want to marry someone who's already married at that time? But I think a lot of the times, and this also applies actually in everyday life practice, the person that gets forgotten a lot is the first wife, because she oftentimes is the one bearing a lot of the social stigma and narrative that says that you were inadequate. That's why your husband wanted to take on a second, third wife. And that actually is a reason that happens in status quo, that a lot of the reason why husbands want to take on second, third, fourth wives is because either your first wife can't bear you children, or that your first wife is aging, right? As if the husband's not aging, but apparently it's an acceptable thing to take on more wives because you want younger bodies to attach yourself to. So I think that's something to keep in mind of when speaking about polygamy. Obviously there are pros to it, but we'll get to the opposition case in a second. Second is that it creates a false sense of security. Women are not as disenfranchised as back when polygamy was first allowed. Again, referring back to the context that I spoke about as to when polygamy was first ordained. Secondly, is that for the ones that are still disenfranchised, like a lot of the reasonings for why polygamy should be allowed is because there are women that are financially disenfranchised, and marrying someone gives them a little bit more of that financial freedom. However, there exists many other support structures in status quo in comparison to back then. We have many NGOs, many feminist movements, microfinancing agencies that specifically are targeted to women, state welfare, company, corporate social responsibilities to train and hire women, etc. Thirdly is the notion that marriage is your get out of poverty card is probably what dupes many women into agreeing to polygamy to begin with, right? Second wives agree because they need some money. Obviously not saying that this is always the case. This is characterization of some subsections of women and the calculation that them and their families make in order to enter into a polygamous marriage. So second wives agree because they need money. First wives accept because they believe that they're doing a good deed by helping that second wife, when really what they're walking into is a bigger problem, because once you're married it is unclear if your husband will actually treat those wives fairly, especially when there is an air of entitlement that you, husband, deserve your wives staying with you and catering to you because you saved them from poverty, right? So again, this is another way to turn it in favor of government in this motion. Fourthly is that it entrenches domesticated gender roles, that the husband's duty is just to provide money and the wife to bear everything else. But at the same time, that the wife's life is still at the behest of the husband because he can afford you, right? And then imagine throwing a child into the picture, into the mix, and imagine the norms that those children pick up from the message and the dynamics that they see of how their parents behave, right? And that can't possibly be good. And that is not something that the state ought to sanction, because presumably the state should also care about what creates like a much more healthy environment for a child to grow up in. And then lastly is like a double standard because women can't have multiple husbands. This is basically the state allowing a very explicit rule that treats men and women very differently. And also, you know, this is not an exhaustive list, obviously. You definitely should also do a lot of the basic characterizations of like, when can a state abolish practices and things, what are those metrics, and then making sure that as you're building your arguments that you are concluding it with telling the judges why is that this meets that metric, or even if you think that this doesn't meet that metric, if you think that there ought to be an additional metric and this polygamy falls into this new metric. That can also be another way of why you decide that states should abolish things. Because whenever you're doing a would not abolish case building, it's not just about listing down the arguments, but also characterizing the state and when states can and cannot do things. So yeah, that's for government. For opposition, and second comic book character is Kamala Khan. So she's Miss Marvel. She's a Pakistani-American superhero who made history by being Marvel's first Muslim superhero to headline their own comic book. So yeah, like Miss Marvel is a pretty big thing. If you're a comic book fan, shout out. Okay, so opposition. It is legitimate for people to subscribe to alternative non-conventional relationships. That's just like the first spin you should be doing, which is like find a way to turn the way in which people perceive polygamy from a, you know, supposedly backwards practice to no, it's just a practice that is not the norm. Something not being the norm or being non-conventional does not necessarily mean it's bad. So firstly, it's a legitimate alternative non-conventional form of relationship. It is explicitly allowed by God. To ban it is to rob Muslims of the holistic experience of being a Muslim, because again, going back to what I said earlier on, Islam is a private and public religion. Polygamy at its core is a choice and an agreement between two consenting Muslim adults. If the first marriage wasn't a problem, it's unclear why the second should be, because if there are concerns about power dynamics and financial concerns coming into the picture, all of those concerns remain stagnant even in the first marriage. So it's unclear why the second marriage should be different. Monogamy should not be state sanctioned, right? Like the state shouldn't be like, we don't want any polygamy, that it should always be just like one partner committing themselves to eternity of togetherness. Because the same as how the state does not criminalize things like open relationships or having multiple partners or even criminalizing cheating, the state shouldn't ban polygamy. Like they should just not police personal lives of people and their romantic lives. And that applies in a very specific Muslim setting, which is about polygamy. Second is that context dictates that polygamy should be allowed more than ever. Firstly, having men make most of the decisions in regulatory bodies is not an argument to ban that action, but an argument to reform that body. So whether that is reformation in the regulation, the reinforcements, or just fighting for more women in decision-making positions. Secondly is that because of all of the support proposition spoke about, the whole NGO, microfinancing, feminist movements that exist in status quo, that's exactly why we should trust women, that they have better support structures now to support themselves in making rational, free choices. Thirdly, is that there are women and families that are legitimately okay with polygamy. It may be unclear of like which women are freely consenting and which ones are being pressured, but that's all the more reason why the state should err on the side of preserving choice and to just support the reform of making that system better. Furthermore, even if in the worst case that there are women who are getting duped into these polygamous marriages, as what Gov says, this illustrates that the climate of the community is one that affords the women very little resources, support, respect, and worth. Not getting married doesn't change that. It just makes it a constant, as I've mentioned before. If marrying means that she can better feel belonged and less alienated by her community, and if this is something that she decides is important for her survival, then it's worth it, right? Because it's doing what needs to be done to survive. Many women across all sorts of demographics and walks of life do this on a daily basis. It's not an ideal choice, but it is a legitimate choice. We make sacrifices, we make sacrifices, whether that is for someone we love or in order to progress ourselves, whether personally or professionally, right? Or to assimilate. And to eventually climb up the ladder so that we get to be in positions that eventually empower us to make better choices for other women that don't have that privilege. And then lastly is that this does not fulfill the metric of when states should abolish something. So remember I said about the whole characterization about needing to tell me when can states ban. So when can states ban? Well, it's when they can prove that in all likeliness the act brings harms. Obviously, this is not the only way to characterize of when a state should ban something, but this is just an example. Well, when states are unsure and relies on speculative harm, the argument of erring on the side of caution, which many debaters run, by restricting that choice and banning that action is actually a negligent thing to do. Because when states want to tell society, you can't do something, the burden is on the state to prove why they cannot. It shouldn't be the other way around of society needing to convince the state that this is our right. Because the state is just given way too much power otherwise. So in conclusion, government wants to abolish a choice they A, can't prove definite harms to, B, even where harms exist, abolishing doesn't fix it because all of government's metric of why polygamy is wrong is the same metric for why any marriages within that context is wrong. So kind of like pushing the burden back onto government. Yeah, so that's just like some ideas and some application of what I spoke about earlier on onto this motion. Another motion, I'm not going to analyze it, but just for like the usage of the audiences watching this, another idea is like, this house believes that feminist movements should oppose organized religion. And again, on the side here is actually one of my favorite comic book characters who is actually not, who was not created by like a big mainstream company like Marvel. It was just created by an art student, a very young art student, Dina. So this is Kahira, right? She is an Egyptian superhero, and I love this specific comic. I will not read it, you can see it. Yeah. Okay, so I believe that there will be a segment for questions right after this lecture, but just on face value, I just wanted to address some questions that I have commonly received throughout my debating career. So first off is how not to sound offensive as a non-Muslim debating about Islamic issues. So I know that in a lot of equity briefings, we hear about how when you're speaking about minority groups or any other groups that you don't belong to, in order to be more mindful of the language that you're using, it's best to speak as though a member of that community is in the room with you. I think this is good advice. But I also think that it's very human for that person who is speaking and imagining a world where a member of that community is in the room, or you don't even have to imagine, most of the times they're there, is that you also tend to overcompensate and feel like you're walking on eggshells and you're unsure of how far can you go to characterize, but at the same time, you don't want to sound offensive. And I think this is very legitimate, right? Because you don't want to be offensive, but at the same time, you also want to empathize and be able to truthfully speak about the struggles of this community. Because I don't think that communities ever think like, when we're talking about our struggles, that this issue ought to be exclusively only ours to speak about, because they recognize that in order for change to happen, other people need to take their concerns seriously. And in order for people to do that, they need to also engage in that conversation. So it's just about like how to be more equitable in entering those conversations. So my advice is to analyze incentives. Feelings and reactions shouldn't be assumed. So like every other stakeholder in any other non-Islamic debate, do not take for granted and baselessly insert in character without doing in the work of explaining why that characterization is likely. Right? Like, I mean, we do it all the time when we're not talking about community. Sometimes even when we're having debates about Trump, right? On one hand, we're like, Trump is isolationist. On the other hand, it's like, no, Trump has beef with Iran. Those two things can exist simultaneously. And there will be situations where, Gov will argue the isolationist part and opposition will argue the, doesn't like Iran and actually wants to declare war with the whole world part. And the only way a judge is going to believe which one is more likely is if you actually build the incentives as to why you think that this claim is true. So the same thing applies here. So just be as specific as possible to the structure or institution or practice or policy of the religion that you think is problematic, right? For example, it's more reasonable to say polygamy regulated by Islamic institutions that are dominated by men have features that make the practice a lot less empowering for women. It's true, right? Or if you think polygamy inherently is non-empowering to women, start listing out what are the foundations of which polygamy stands on and how those foundations were interpreted or how those foundations are enforced and practiced, right? That's a lot more persuasive to say versus Islam doesn't care about women, they allow polygamy. Like that's probably going to sound, less persuasive and frankly speaking, super simplistic and ignorant, right? It's like reducing all of the concerns that women have in Islam to just polygamy. So I think don't be lazy in characterizations, right? Always go the extra mile. Why is this true? Why is this likely? Why is this important? What are the specificities that you know? And if you don't know the specificities about that minority group, just think about like the natural incentives that a human being would have when placed in that situation, right? So if you are a woman, you're placed in a situation where you are not listened to, that's not a nice feeling. Why? What are the feelings that you feel? Like, how does that translate into how you view yourself in the eyes of society and how you function as a member of society? Do you feel happy, right? And you start listing those things out. So I think that's the best way I can say how not to sound offensive when talking about any issue, but specifically. Secondly, it's how to best apply your niche knowledge when in a debate about your minority community. Obviously, every time when we see a motion comes up that speaks about our country, our race, our religion, we get excited because we're like, yes, I know this by heart. And sometimes we still don't win, right? And that's because we skip out on the basics. So I think my first tip is like, don't get too excited to jump to the niche religious rulings that you know, like the verses from the Holy Scripture that you memorized, right? Like a lot of debaters are like that. Like, great, I can churn out all of the things that I know out of being well-read and I memorized the entire holy text. Like, great, good for you. That tells me as a judge that you're well-read, but it doesn't tell me that you're a good debater, right? So I think instead what you need to do is trust your own experiences and your story, because the truth is anyone can Google up verses to a holy text or Google up the facts about your race or your community. But not everyone can tell the story of what it's like to have grown up in that community, right? Like the subtleties of everyday religious cultural practices that made all the difference in your day-to-day life, right? Like think about all of those feelings and structure it. Think about all of the reactions, think about the conversations, and then find a way to package those experiences into a proper argument structure, because you also don't want to spend 7 minutes ranting about your childhood. So again, dry religious rulings can help make you sound well-read, but those verses only matter in so much as how they are applied to everyday life and how they make people feel. So I think this is why the best of speakers, when they're talking about their own community and emotion that speaks about it, the best ones oftentimes are the ones that sound the most human, right? They find ways to humanize their arguments and tell a story that makes you feel attached, as if you're walking through that life with them, as opposed to just like dropping facts left and right. Thirdly, where a trade-off exists between Islamic principles versus ideals of women's liberation, which are Muslim women more likely to choose? So I think, again, this depends. So the same as how I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, that no woman acts the same. Women are different human beings. We all have different opinions. But also one woman is allowed to have different opinions throughout her lifetime, right? It's just how life is. We check on things like, what kind of Islamic school of thought does she follow? Is it Shia? Is it Sunni? If it's Sunni, there are like whole subdivisions of school of thought as well. Like, are you a Shafi'i, Hanafi, Maliki? Point is not to know about the name of the school of thought, but to acknowledge the fact that different Islamic schools of thought influences people differently. What specific Islamic practices are we talking about that is in contention? Is it about hijab? Is it about polygamy? Is it about conversion out of Islam? Is it about the ability to be an imam and lead a male congregation, right? Like, again, different women will have different feelings about this. What are the specific practices in contention that is supposedly championing these women's liberation, right? Are we talking about equal pay? Are we talking about equal opportunity? Are we talking about abortion rights? Anything. And what kind of Islamic community was she raised in? Because again, the whole purpose of this lecture was to do two things. One is to talk about feminist struggles and women's struggles in Islam, but secondly, also to highlight the fact that there are some struggles that are exclusive to your community and your demographic. And then it's also important to note that for many Muslim women, they just don't buy into the secular divisions of what is considered as Islamic principles versus what is considered as women's liberation, right? Sometimes acting within the framework of Islam, and as many Islamic feminists have shown, to them is liberating, right? So it's unclear what is this dichotomy of Islamic principles versus women's liberation. To them, Islamic principles can also stand for women's liberation, and women's liberation at times can actually be counterproductive. Like, it depends on how you view it, right? When I say women's liberation, obviously I don't mean it in like the most literal sense. I mean like according to what people's contextual understanding of women's liberation is. So these Islamic feminists, they don't feel suffocated by God. They feel suffocated by the men who have defamed God. So those kind of context is important. And to the extent that a dichotomy can actually be achieved, then you go back to the first thing I said, which is like asking yourself a whole bunch of these different questions, because it's the same as any other person in any other conflict that they have in their life, right? Like, and you ask yourself, what would be the intuitive reaction? Like, you won't be able, and likely you won't be able to come up with only one reaction. And that's probably because that's meant to reflect how, how pluralistic this world is, and also just a much more realistic picture, because, we want to convince ourselves that we're always principally consistent as human beings. When we're not, we pick and choose, and we find different ways to justify different things that benefit us, or what is worth sacrificing. Right, so that's another thing. And that is basically my lecture.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Do you mind stop sharing the screen so that we can see again? Thank you. So as mentioned in the beginning, we have collected questions from the community, but before starting to ask them, regarding the content of the lecture. If you don't mind, I would like to ask just a few personal questions so that people from the community will get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah.
So you described a lot of history with religion and gender. Do you mind sharing with us how you've gotten to the realization that you want to be involved in fighting for women's rights?
I got involved in wanting to fight for women's rights, I think, from a very young age. Obviously, back then, I didn't think about like, oh, a big movement, a big institutionalized, structured group. It was more of like, you know, from a very young age, I had like an annoying older brother that would always leave me out of things. And I was always like, no, I am just as good, if not better, right? And I think that already started a feeling in me to be like, hold up, this is actually a feeling that not only my brother had, but all of his friends, and they would all purposefully leave me out. And it's kind of like this really childish worldview of basically what was a circle that was mimicking the patriarchy, right? And that group of guys neglecting me, woman, girl, I am capable. And then that created a fascination in the advocacy work. And then as I grew up, I also got more interested in a lot of the literature around it, a lot of the media around it. And then I started learning about the actual formal structures that exist out there and wanting to be more involved with it. So that's how it started off.
I very much like this answer. As someone who's very likely an annoying older brother himself, I hope that the outcome is going to be that at least it means that my sister is going to, you know, be able to make a huge impact in women's rights in the world. Do you mind sharing some recommendations for people who are listening or seeing this and want to enter the field? For example, if someone wants to start an internship or full-time work in a women's aid organization, what do you think they should do?
So like straight up, just go on their website, or if they don't have a website, if a lot of these movements and organizations have Instagram accounts and Facebook accounts, I actually think social media has made things a lot more accessible. Find like their contacts, they usually would like link it up and just message them, because a lot of the times these movements function on two bases. Number one, they lack resources, they lack manpower, and they're always happy for someone that, you know, who wants to help. Secondly, especially someone who's interested and is passionate about it, because I think the foundation of a lot of these groups is that they want buy-in. They want people to have the realization that this is a good cause. So when someone contacts them and says that I care about this, to my knowledge, very rarely are they just going to be like, nope. And I think for the situations where, if unfortunately people don't get replies, this is going to sound really funny, but like as someone who like worked in the NGO and like was dealing with emails and all of that, like email them again, right? It is not because they don't want you, it's because they actually lack manpower to be able to respond to every single email that they're getting.
It's very insightful. Do you think that there are some actions that are needed to be taken a priori, or if you want to get involved, it's likely that they're just going to have a role for you in most places?
Yeah, so I think that, again, like always find whatever you feel most comfortable with as your starting point. But if you just want to like dive in head first, like message them and like tell them and be like, look, these are the interests that I have. If you have a specific field or a niche that you like about that NGO, tell them that this is the thing that you're interested in. I don't think that you actually need some highly specific like information or knowledge prior to that, especially when a lot of these times the NGOs try to make their causes as accessible as possible. They always try to humanize it and say that the everyday person can be involved, that it always just takes one person to have that realization. So I think if you tell them that you don't have a priori knowledge or experience, I think they'll still be very receptive and they'll guide you along the way.
I think that's a very encouraging answer. So you also have a very extensive background in debate education. I assume that some people may also be very interested in continuing their debating career and getting engaged with companies such as LearningLeaders that we mentioned in the intro. Do you have recommendations to this field as well, if people want to get involved in this direction?
Yeah, so I think if they're interested, they should definitely pursue it, right? And I think it's important to also note that when it comes to pursuing like a type of career, it's okay to decide that this is the career that you want for yourself, like end game. And it's also okay for you to decide that this is the career that I want in the meantime. So I know many debate companies are actually very encouraging to multiple debaters that say, I want to lend my knowledge and my expertise and my help, maybe not for the rest of my life, but I want to be here for like a few months, a few years, just because I think that because a lot of debate companies put a high premium on knowledge and self-expansion and that journey, I think they're happy to be a part of your journey as well, to kind of go through your own professional expansion. But also, I think like from a personal point of view, having like, I wouldn't say super high turnaround rate, but like having like a higher turnaround rate in comparison to other companies for debate companies is actually not necessarily a bad thing, because debating evolves very quickly. I think that when like you have people with more relevant knowledge coming in as opposed to the same stagnant group of people who aren't necessarily keeping up to date, may not always be the best thing for a debate.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair comment. Do you think that debating played a part? So you touched on it a little, but do you think that debating played a part in your interest or in developing your interest in women's rights and feminism?
Yeah, for sure. I think firstly, it taught me to be a lot more structured in my approach towards research, my approach towards how I want to do my advocacy work. It has also taught me a lot of discipline. It's taught me to be a lot more unapologetic when it comes to voicing out my opinions. Like, because and when I say unapologetic, I think the thing that debating has taught me is I think a judgment call of also picking your battles. I feel like when I say that, just because I feel like when you're constructing a case, right, and you're looking at a motion, you're also, you know, there are like 10 billion arguments that you can make, but you kind of decide which are the more important arguments that you know is going to be most persuasive to the audience or the judge, depending on the issue that you're trying to address. And I think that kind of train of thought has also been applied in the way that I do my advocacy work, in deciding, even if I think there are 10 different things I want to fight for, there are timelines and ways for me to approach this. And then what kind of delivery approach do I want to adopt as well?
Yeah, I can relate to many parts of these answers. Would you change anything in your trajectory so far that you think would have placed you in a better position right now in your life?
I feel like maybe, I don't know, maybe because I'm going through like a mid-20s crisis. But like there is a part of me that, so after I graduated from law school, I took a year off just to kind of like take a break, because, you know, it was like nonstop formal education since a wee little age. And then I just wanted a breather. And I'm not going to lie, it was also because I needed to figure out what I wanted to do. I just wish that at the same time of figuring out what I wanted to do long term, I also did a lot more professional or advocacy work in the short term and not just debating. Because in that year, I did a lot of debating. I have no regrets about all of that debating and all of those travels. But I just wish that for the time that I was at home, I also lent more help towards like more non-debate work. I was heavily coaching. I was coaching world schools, but I just wish that I got a little bit more exposure to advocacy experiences.
Do you mind sharing some of your future plans or the biggest challenges that you're facing right now?
I get so anxious about this. So I'm studying for the GMAT. I'm trying to move away from the law trajectory. Not that I regret my law degree, by the way. I mean, I think it was hell difficult, but I think that it's a very good degree to have. It's a very flexible degree as well, and it's a professional degree at it as well. But I don't want to practice law, and I want to gain a little bit more knowledge. My worry is that, you know, we'll see how this GMAT goes, and then, you know, all of my future after that just kind of depends on that. Obviously, I'm having like a plan B and a plan C that doesn't rely on that. And in the meantime, I'm also trying to do more short-term. I wouldn't say short-term, but like I'm not like. I want to do a little bit more than just like studying, you know, on my day-to-day basis here. So that includes actually trying to do a little bit more advocacy work. I want to share a little bit more about this, but just because like it is literally happening as is and I don't want to jinx it, I promise that I will like make it publicly known once it's put together.
That's very good, you know. Now we're also leaving the viewers with suspense that they have things. So thank you for being willing to share. But now, you know, we've taken a detour from the actual content of the talk itself. So let's get back to it right now. We've, as said before, collected a set of questions from the community, and I'll just start sharing what different members wanted to ask you. So, do you think that there are more things that we can do to make debating more inclusive from people who follow the Muslim faith?
Yes, definitely. For example, I think that it is tragic that we put such a high premium on putting so much money into providing like alcohol for people at socials at the expense of things like food or non-alcoholic drinks. I'm not saying that, you know, if hosts want to provide this for participants, that they should, but it should be equally important to provide people with food. Firstly, even just for the alcohol drinkers, right? Like you shouldn't be drinking on an empty stomach. Secondly, like, you know, if you're a Muslim, like, and not just if you're a Muslim, right? If you are a human being, you're not going to be a very happy person if you're hungry. Right? What more when there is nothing to compensate for it? Like some people are like, whatever, I'm hungry, but I'll just drink it off away and I won't remember anyways. No, sober people remember, okay? And we remember we didn't get good food. So that's one. Number two is a lot of the times, a lot of socials are constantly set up in like clubs, and like bar atmospheres, and I think that we can afford to move away from that and provide something from time to time a little bit more wholesome, so that people feel comfortable going to those socials, independent of that. And of course, lastly, it's like if you're running a tournament on a Friday, be mindful of the fact that like some Muslims go for compulsory Friday prayers, and that requires just a little bit more time.
I think that's great, and hopefully more tournaments are going to follow these guidelines in the future.
Yeah, and also just like a last thing is also like if it's Ramadan, like provide like I actually think a lot of like Muslim debaters are super accommodating. They're like, it's okay, run rounds, it's fine. I just want to make sure that I have access to like food and water to make sure that I can break my fast during the debate. Like I have been to tournaments where literally what happened was it was coming near to iftar, like time for you to break fast. And the tournament was like, here's a frozen piece of lasagna. And we're like, what are we supposed to do with this? They're like, go find a microwave during prep. We actually went looking for the microwave during prep and it didn't even exist.
You ended up eating the frozen lasagna? What did you do?
No, just drank water.
That is unfortunate. So you touched a little bit about misconceptions. A member of the community was interested to know, what do you think are the biggest myths that exist in debate land on Islam?
So I think many. Just by virtue of the fact that I don't think it's like a debater inherent thing. I think it's just like a societal inherent thing, right? Like many of us tend to have misconceptions and stereotypes about communities that we are not often exposed to, just by sheer fact of having less access to that information. I think some of that includes things like, I think just the inherent belief that like Islam has no structures whatsoever that is meant to empower women, right? And there are many examples of that. I've listed some. Obviously, again, it's debatable, but I think that's the thing about any religious ruling, right? Is because it is based off of interpretation of people. So I think the misconception stems out of like a very non-generous reading of what those rulings imply. And I think secondly is I think not just Islam as a religion, but also off of Muslims. I think in debating communities, maybe less so now, hopefully, but I think more so before, where there was constant shock at the same way as how, like, you know, ESL debaters feel annoyed when people are like, oh my God, your English is so good, or like, oh my God, you're such a good debater. The same frustration applies to when you are a hijabi, right? It's like the ESL and then sometimes the Asian aspect. And then it's like, oh my God, she's wearing a hijab and she's aggressive. Like it's frustrating. I mean, it feels good to disprove them, but it's still not nice because it means that opponents and judges come into the room with a preconceived notion of what your speech is meant to entail before even having heard it.
I think it's a very good message. So you touch upon the relationship a lot between feminism and Islam, and one of the members of the community wanted to know how people in traditional Muslim societies, do they view feminism in relation to the West? And if so, how is the interaction is probably looking like?
So yeah, I do think that in many traditional communities, in many Islamic traditional communities, they do view feminism as like a conduit of the West. And I think this is because I don't necessarily think it's because they are oppositional towards gender equality, right? And this is like a giving them benefit of the doubt. I just think that they have a bad idea about the word feminism, that feminism immediately means a whole list of things, that you have to be anti-religion, that you have to be like part of the free the nipple movement, that you have to be like for pussy riots, you have to be like all of the things that are deemed as against conservatism or religion or any preservation of culture. So I think this is why when people speak about female empowerment, even more educated women who come from traditional backgrounds who had the privilege of getting better education also say, like, I believe in female empowerment, I believe in gender equality, but like I just don't identify as a feminist. And I think this also has to do with the fact that if you come from like super like conservative traditional communities like enclaves, presumably the access to information that you have is a lot less, which means that the access to information that you actually get are the ones that get peddled a lot. And a lot of the times the feminist message and media that gets peddled a lot is a very Western version of feminism, right? So I think that's how people end up getting to that misconception.
Interesting. Do you have ideas on how to fix that? Or more broadly, a member of the community wanted to ask you, what can we do in order to improve gender equality in traditional, more conservative religious societies, and in particular Islam?
So I do think that the method of Islamic feminism is a very good start, which is like not necessarily packaging gender equality in a way that is oppositional towards religion, but rather using the religious framework to say that actually it is pro-religion to be pro-gender equality. That's one, the framework. Secondly is, if we're talking about like actual physical, visible things, I think it just has a lot to do with like having more sources of, whether it's videos or whether it's books, articles. Again, this is why social media is great. More blogs, more debate, right? And I think this is actually part of the reason why I genuinely believe that like debate education, stepping out of metropolitan cities and going and doing all of these outreach programs, and why they're important, because I think what they do is not just like come in and be like, okay guys, we need to have a talk about polygamy, right? Like you don't necessarily have to go in and immediately hit them with the hard stuff, but even just teaching them things like critical thinking, and telling them like you need to not just absorb everything that you are being taught and have a mind of your own and question yourself, where do these things come from? And actually having a better understanding of where these rulings come from probably also makes you a better religious person, because like according to Islam, I don't think Islam ever says that it's, in fact, there are verses that say that it's pretty terrible if all you do is just accept the religion and never once ask yourself if this is actually a good thing, because God only ever prescribes to you good stuff.
So as a follow-up to that, do you think that there are interesting rooms for cooperations between Islam and other faiths in that regard in order to promote women's rights?
I think so. I think so, but to be honest, feasibly speaking, I think this is going to be a little bit difficult, because in the sense that like even if those two different organizations want to collaborate with each other, it's unclear why is that the receiving community wants to accept it, right? Because on face value, they're immediately going to be like, nope, if you're cooperating with other people, how do we know that the Islam you're teaching is the true kind of Islam? So as unfortunate as it seems, I think optics matter, right? Because a lot of the times these people reject on face value, and you want to kind of get over that barrier first before you can teach them anything meaningful.
The vast majority of current organizations that operate in the field, are they dedicated and mostly operate inside one school of Islam, or do they tend to be more pan-Islamic in their nature and this is just not an issue?
So I think that a lot of, it depends, right? Like there are some groups that are a little bit more universal and kind of use different schools of thought. So like Sisters in Islam, one of the biggest Islamic feminist movements here in Southeast Asia, I know on their website like quotes different rulings from different schools of thought, right? Sometimes they talk about the Hanafi school of thought, sometimes they talk about Maliki school of thought, but it becomes difficult because sometimes some communities are very fixated on what kind of religious school of thought they follow. Like Malaysia specifically follows the Shafi'i school of thought, which is actually the most conservative school of thought within the Sunni sect. This is very different than a lot of subcontinent countries that follow the Hanafi school of thought that is a lot more lenient. So those things tend to matter towards the recipient of that information.
Okay, that's great. So these were the questions that we've taken from members of the community at large, but we also have a live audience here that is listening, and I would like to give them a chance to also ask you some questions. So I'll act as the moderator, and if you want to ask something, just raise your hand and I'll just tell you, and then you can go ahead. So audience, would someone would like to ask a question? Hadar, go ahead.
So it sounds from a lot of what you described during the lecture that in fact, many of the problems that are for women in Islam are specific for impoverished women in Islam, because women who have money are more accessible to actually be able to use the court in their favor, etc. I was wondering if you think that this is more of a classist issue than a gender issue, or are the things that you think are a struggle for wealthy women in Islam as well to a large extent?
So I think that it's both, right? I do think class matters, as you mentioned. It is true that many of these structures are like take on a harder hit if you are not financially empowered. But I think many of the things are also quite gendered. And that's because even if a woman is like super rich, like you'll still hear a lot of stories from like Saudi aristocratic women that are still trying to flee the country. Just because they are still dealing with a lot of abuse, they're still dealing with limited freedoms. So I think to the extent where money comes in the picture, sure, maybe she will be able to hire a good lawyer, but it doesn't negate the fact that if a lot of the people who are making those decisions, like the judges, just believe that she's still a woman and this is still something that is meant to be in favor of the man, then there's only so much money that you can throw at them and they're just not going to change their mind, right? And I think the second aspect of that, which is probably an overlap between class and gender, is that also bearing in mind that while it's true that a woman who is impoverished is, going up against what is often a man that is much richer, in a situation where a woman is rich, it is still true that the man is richer than that already rich woman, right? So again, that's like kind of the overlap that exists.
Do we have any further questions from the audience? Yeah, Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on the concept of like the way Western feminism is perceived, but do you feel like any parts of Western feminism is in fact seeping into these communities, these cultures, and if so, what exactly and how?
Right. So I think that they definitely do have an influence on Islamic feminism, and that's not necessarily because like Western values are seeping into like the Islamic world, but rather because there is an overlap of what is considered as universal good, right? So things like the point at which like Western feminists are saying that women deserve equal pay and women deserve equal opportunity at the workplace. A lot of Islamic feminists are also fighting for that. And this is where like they use Khadija, as I spoke about before, in saying that like, no, women do have a right to work. And then they also then use a lot of the arguments that are based off of logic that are not necessarily oppositional towards Islamic value that they gain from Western feminists in order to fuel their case to say, this is why we deserve these rights. That's one. Number two, it's also the fact that a lot of Western feminists have a lot more resources in comparison to groups that are based within the Islamic feminist context. And I think that it's great times where Western feminist groups, or rather like international feminist groups that people perceive as Western, so like a lot of the efforts that like UN Women have been doing, so it's not necessarily Western, but because it's part of UN, like the rest of the world kind of always thinks like, oh, America, or what other European countries attaches itself to. I think it's great when these movements also lend resources, lend cooperation, lend mentorship towards a lot of these women within the Islamic feminist context to better strategize. So I think that that transfer of information and support in terms of actual resources has helped like Islamic feminists paddle their own concerns further.
Do we have any further questions? Noga, go ahead.
Right. So how much is being an Islamic feminist is necessarily a dichotomy or a trade-off between being a feminist and having good relations with the community, the family?
So like if there's a difference between the two, or like how different is it? Is that your question? Sorry, just asking for clarification.
More like if being an Islamic feminist is necessarily being with a conflict with your community or close relation.
No, I definitely don't think so, right? Again, this goes back to what kind of Islamic feminist you are, I guess. I think based on my understanding of what we've gone through in terms of Islamic feminists just wanting to practice their religion, but at the same time ensuring that within their own religious rulings and religious practices there exists gender equality. I actually don't think it's oppositional to like the non-Islamic version of feminism that is propagated within like general society. And I actually think if anything, it can be seen as like in spirit of that, because if it's true that women have the freedom of choice, and if subscribing to a religion is deemed as a legitimate choice, and people are able to subscribe to whatever religion and a lot of the other, responsibilities and rulings that come along with that religion, it's unclear why it is that if a woman chooses to use her freedom of religion to subscribe to Islam and then chooses to practice those Islamic rulings and then use gender equality to ensure that those gender rulings are equitable to her and her fellow female members, it doesn't have to be oppositional. In fact, it can be in spirit of.
That's great. Are there any more questions from the audience? Rachel, go ahead.
So, like a recent trend in debating, and so this is more debate than specific knowledge based, but has been going from like a debates being set in liberal democracies and Western democracies, and now they're more set in functioning democracies. So now we have motions that are more like this house is a feminist movement would, that are also being set in places like Malaysia, places like Indonesia, and not just places like Europe and the US. How, like, given that there's even less of a consensus as to what that means and how feminism interacts with these type of communities, how would you suggest kind of approaching these type of things within that framework? So
I think, first of all, it would be helpful if we're talking about functioning democracies. And I actually think this is like a tricky situation, not just within like a feminist debate context, but even like in any debate motion, right? It's like functioning democracy, and then someone says Singapore, and they're like, not really though. And then like a whole debate happens there, right? So I think the same thing applies here, which is, first of all, it is important to note the extent of how much religion affects those communities. So even if it's a functioning democracy, do they have formalized institutions for that religion? So like moral policing and like courts that are based off of that religion, because then that kind of tells you the kind of hurdles that the feminist movement will have to go through and how embedded they are and how institutionalized those struggles are. So that's one. Number two, I think that because it's not based in Western liberal democracies, I think if anything, it probably makes the argument of building the reality of the patriarchy a lot easier, actually, versus a world where, because I think sometimes also debaters take it for granted. They're like, Western liberal democracies, and they're like, oh, sexism is not that bad. And some people's like, no, actually, it's still pretty bad. It's just, a little less in your face, maybe. I don't know, that's like for lack of a better word. And I think that I would, again, just like move away from not just like the formal structures of the patriarchy, but also speaking about like the kind of day-to-day activities that a lot of the religious communities go through in those countries, and then speak about how those feminists are perceived as. And I also think the third thing to bear in mind is that, especially when we're talking about functioning democracies, and because it's so like wide ranged, and because actually it's not a typical Western liberal democracy country, the other aspect you have to take into account is also the cultural aspect. The feminist movements will always not just go against the typical patriarchal hurdle, will not just go through the typical religious hurdle, but now also like the cultural nationalistic hurdle that exists out there. So I think when you want to talk about the feminist strategies and techniques, I think if you can contextualize these differences and say how the feminist movement is able to mitigate it, maybe not solve it, but like mitigate it, and then find ways to eventually create good out of that, I think it creates a much more realistic picture of achieving the goals of the feminist movement.
Interesting. So we have time for last one or two questions. Do we have another member of the audience that wants to ask something? Bella, go ahead.
Most of your lecture was focused on Islam in specifically countries which have a majority of Islam, and I was wondering what sorts of lines of analysis do you think we should change or adapt for like Islamic enclaves in Western countries, immigrants, etc. And mainly, how do you think the feminist movement could be more inclusive to Muslims in their own countries?
Right. So I think in those situations, I think first of all, the feminist movement probably have to also, I think, have an added layer of responsibility, which is bridging the gap between the two communities, right? Because your responsibility now is to, or maybe not responsibility, but the strategic thing to do is to go to these enclaves. And first off, you need to make sure that you are not perceived through a lens of like, you are the other trying to steal our religion and culture away, right? So bearing in mind that the tactiques that the feminist movement should use should also be in spirit of that, and that would obviously depend on what the debate policy is suggesting. So finding ways that are deemed as non-threatening but still getting the message across. That's one. Number two is also the feminist movement, I think, shaping a culture in that enclave that basically says the outside world wants to have you, right? Because a lot of the times the reason why enclaves become enclaves is because they believe that they can't, there's no point to integrating, or a lot of the times the only way for us to preserve our culture is if we just keep into our tight-knit community. So I think creating a less intimidating environment of the outside world. And then I think thirdly is for the feminist movement to also do their job outside of the enclaves to make sure that you are cultivating an environment that makes the outside world accepting of those enclaves, right? Because the last thing you want is a situation where you're like, we are non-threatening, we actually have a really good message, and then you've convinced the enclaves that like the outside world is happy to cooperate, and then they come out and then they're like, you lied to us, you know, and that could probably backtrack and regress a lot of the initial progress you were making, because now anything you say, the community isn't going to trust you because they just deem that you're not credible anymore. So I think those are the three different aspects of stages that the feminist movement need to keep in mind in that specific context.
Do we have someone that wants to ask the last question? I will do it. So let's say that there are individuals that want to help right now to advance the causes that we talked about within the context of this lecture, but they don't necessarily have a movement behind them or a lot of excess resources or like time or money. And also taking into account that we're in a very weird time in the history of the world right now, you know, being locked down in many different countries around the world and being, you know, maybe very harshly struck by the issues that are brought up by COVID. What do you think are the highest impact things to do? Do you think there is something that can be done given all of these circumstances?
So I think the highest impact thing that you can do that doesn't involve any resources and doesn't rely on the cooperation of someone else, right? Because it'd be great if you can start something bigger, like a movement, like an online NGO that eventually translates into a physical NGO, but that's a bit hard to do on your own. Usually you need a little bit more cooperation from other people. But let's say you don't even have that, right? I think that the most impactful things actually are the smallest of things. So things like going on social media and actually sharing some articles, and don't just share articles or share a video, write your opinion about it, right? Because I think what people are more interested in, like if you are a friend, is the reason why I would click on something is if I saw a really good friend had an opinion about it and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. This person had this thing to say about it. I'm just going to open it and read about it, right? Secondly is to recommend different things. And especially in this specific lockdown period, recommend stuff. Like ask for recommendations about a movie or a series that you thought spoke about these things or other people had an opinion of. Ask people for book recommendations. If you have a recommendation, talk about it. There are many people during this time that attribute, this is like a really cynical way of putting it, but like there are many people during this lockdown that like attribute some self-importance to like, suddenly everybody's a reviewer about everything, right? They go on Instagram or they go on like Facebook Live and they're like, I want to talk about this thing which nobody asked for, right? So instead of talking about like the new whatever that you bought, talk about a book you read, talk about an experience that you had, talk about a TV show that you read. And it's funny because I actually think some of the most touching messages that I've personally gotten from people that said that, I somehow had like a positive impact in their life wasn't because I did anything big. It was just because like, I think we're so used to having so many debaters on our timeline that we are in an echo chamber, right? We are like, it's actually really not that like big of a hoo-ha for someone to say that they believe in gender equality or they believe in like LGBT rights. But little did I know, when I was posting this stuff, it appeared on someone else's timeline where I was the exception to the norm. That actually then gave that person some courage to, come out or speak about an important thing. So yeah, you'd be surprised at how the little things can make a difference.
Yeah, that was great. I am genuinely grateful for how much I learned within the last 1.5 hours. If you're interested into getting more of this content, please subscribe to this channel. We're also going to attach some links that are recommendations by Ameera and the slides themselves. So thank you very much, and genuinely thank you again, Ameera, for your time.
Thank you.